Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome to today's colloquium, and I have a couple of announcements to make as usual. Next week, we will not have a colloquium due to the Hutchins Medal ceremony, but the following week, on October 11th, Martha Diaz will speak on Time is Illmatic, the journey, the music, and legacy of Nazir Jones. And for now, please welcome Professor Emmanuel Akyompong to the podium. He's Professor of History and African American Studies and Director of the Center for African Studies here.
Thank you. Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce Myles Osborne today at the Du Bois Fellows Colloquium. Myles is a product of the history department here at Harvard and was one of my star students, so this makes this a very special day. He's now an associate professor of history at the University of Colorado in Boulder, where his classes range from the history of sub-Saharan Africa to British imperialism in Africa to contemporary Africa. While at Harvard, he twice received the Derek Bock Award for teaching. His talent has not diminished, for I understand that at the University of Colorado, he has been snagging top awards for teaching and pedagogy. Professor Myles Osborne is an outstanding and exceptional scholar of 20th century East Africa, dedicated to grassroots research and the movements of common people. He is a young scholar, as is apparent. Indeed, it was only a few years ago that he was here at Harvard doing his doctoral work. His interest and extraordinary productivity have already culminated in 3 books that are significant contributions to the fields of colonialism and the histories of Africa, Kenya, and Mau Mau, and several journal articles. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that while most studies of the Mau Mau emergency focus on the Kikuyu, Kenya's largest ethnic group, Myles' work has been innovative and has served historical and scholarly justice by attending to the Kamba, an ethnic group related geographically and culturally to the Kikuyu, their relationship to British colonial administration, and their role in the Mau Mau Rebellion. Myles Osborne is the author of the prize-winning Ethnicity and Empire in Kenya, Loyalty and Martial Race Among the Kamba, the co-author of Africans and Britons in the Age of Empires, 1660 to 1980, and editor of The Life and Times of General China, Mau Mau and the End of Empire in Kenya. Now for his fellowship project, he's at work on a 4th book that provides a global perspective on the Mau Mau and the ways the movement shaped Pan-Africanism as an intellectual movement that encompassed the aspirations of the subaltern of histories below. He conducted 150 interviews for his book Ethnicity and Empire, and nearly 100 of these interviews are at the heart of this current project. A talented oral historian, he writes with a sensitivity that compares the lives of ordinary people and also underscores his own very deep humanity. So let me end with a little story about Myles that speaks to his selfless character. I know he's all read already, as this will not be on his CV. Myles is an avid mountain climber. His lifelong ambition has been to climb to the summit of Mount Everest. This cherished ambition came close to fulfillment in 2006, as Myles and a party of 3 made their way to the summit. Then they spotted an Australian climber whose expedition had left him for dead. Relinquishing their lifelong ambition to reach the top of Mount Everest, they rescued this poor Australian. So you can also imagine that he's quite the hero among Boulder's outdoorsy climber community. Please join me in welcoming Myles Osborne as he speaks today on Mau Mau are angels sent by Haile Selassie, a Kenyan war in Jamaica. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. That's far too kind.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Emmanuel always gives the most generous introductions that I think I should just say, stay seated and kind of call it a day and say that we're good now. Thank you, Emmanuel, for that. And I was tremendously fortunate to be a graduate student here under the watchful eyes of Emmanuel and Caroline Elkins, both of whom have this enviable ability to be both rigorous scholars and generous mentors. So for me to be back here today, speaking as a Hutchins Fellow gives me a great deal of pleasure, and particularly seeing what the Hutchins Center has become in the last 9 years. I think it's nothing short of extraordinary. Today, I'm following in the footsteps of William Julius Wilson, Maisha Cherry, and David Bindman. It's my great honor to be following them, and I hope you will enjoy today's talk. In 1954, Mau Mau began a reign of terror. Taking ranks like general and colonel, members of Mau Mau carried out a series of attacks on police posts. They raided the homes of respectable, middle-class people and robbed them after dark. Members of Mau Mau served death threats to local white settler families. Most of these missives were attached to fence posts and had "Death to the Whites" written at the bottom, and were often adorned with a skull and crossbones. Somehow, Mau Mau seemed able to move around undetected despite the best efforts of the police to stop them. The organization was largely comprised of dispossessed youth who had few options in life. But in Mau Mau, they found a way to succeed, to earn respect and to earn some money. Whether you were white or black and middle class, you made sure that you were home at night. Such was the success that Mau Mau had after dark. I'm describing, of course, Kingston, Jamaica, in the mid-1950s, and the activities of a criminal gang known as Mau Mau. At the same time, an anthropologist at Oberlin College, George Simpson, who you can see here, was conducting his research on Rastafari in Kingston. Sitting in on a large number of local meetings and reasoning sessions, Simpson noticed a similar theme. He described how Rastas were aware of the suffering that they and Kenyans were experiencing at the hands of British colonialism. Skip, I'm sorry of your injury. Okay.
It's just to get sympathy from fellows.
Okay, that's a good reason. So our Rastas are aware of the suffering that they and Kenyans are both experiencing at the hands of British colonialism. They said that this suffering would surely fade with relocation to their homeland of Ethiopia. That transition would be brought in part by Mau Mau. And I quote here, "Mau Mau is a war between black men and white men. And the black men are angels of deliverance, sent by Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, to drive white men out of Africa." Once Africa was again black, oppressed blacks from across the world, and particularly Jamaica, could return to their ancestral lands. These poor Rastas of Kingston's urban slums were claiming Pan-African solidarity with Kenyan guerrillas nearly 8,000 miles to the east. Now, Mau Mau is a war with which many of you will be familiar. Taking place in Kenya, it lasted throughout the 1950s in a state of emergency and pitted the British and their so-called loyalist allies against dreadlocked Mau Mau fighters. The fighters operated from bases in the thick forests of central Kenya and carried out a guerrilla war from there. By its end, close to 100,000 Kenyans had been detained in what were essentially concentration camps, where abuses were frighteningly common. In the field of African history, more ink has been spilled over Mau Mau than almost any other topic in the field. And yet, strangely, we have failed to consider the impact of this conflict beyond Kenya's borders, despite the fact that it reverberated across the colonized world. In this talk, I will insert Mau Mau into the context of Jamaica in the 1950s. What does this reveal? It permits us to understand the long reach of this Kenyan movement, of course. But it also enables us to see how Mau Mau activated social consciousness in other parts of the colonized world. Mau Mau, in other parts of the what world? Colonized world. Okay. Mau Mau divided Jamaicans in a way that the anti-apartheid struggle never did. Everyone, of course, could agree that apartheid was awful, whether you were a university professor or you were a higgler selling brooms in Kingston, but not with Mau Mau. The movement tugged at Jamaica's social fabric, laying bare the divisions that the decolonizing nation faced. But looking at Mau Mau in Jamaica also enables us to probe more deeply black radicalism on the island. Our attention is drawn especially to the term Pan-Africanism and what it meant in different contexts. The Pan-Africanism represented by men like George Padmore on the right and Kwame Nkrumah on the left has been plagued throughout the 20th century by accusations of elitism. But Pan-Africanism was never the preserve of elites. Poor Jamaicans, too, had their own Pan-African visions, and Mau Mau represented them. For the bottom layer of Jamaican society, Mau Mau represented a Pan-Africanism that would later be expressed by Walter Rodney, Stokely Carmichael, and Black Power in the Caribbean. It was a more radical, sometimes violent, and black-focused vision that ran below, alongside, and sometimes over more traditional views. Now, as historians, we like things to be neat. And we always used to think of the late 1940s and 1950s as the era of the Cold War, the era in which everything was about East versus West. We now know better, that for powerful leaders like American President Dwight Eisenhower and his CIA director, Allen Dulles, this notion was overlaid by visions of a North-South conflict, of a scenario where white America and Western Europe might see conflict with non-aligned nations where people with black and brown skin lived. At a lower level, these concerns were clearly manifested in settler societies from Rhodesia to Algeria to Kenya. The imperial endgame was rarely clear in the early 1950s, so settlers held on, fearing a mass of black people rising up to slaughter them. We see this stoked by the press in a vast outpouring of terror and fear in these sorts of societies, and nowhere more than when it concerned Mau Mau. To give you just one example, South Africa's leading Afrikaner paper, Die Burger, published 804 articles about Mau Mau in the early 1950s. It's more than one article per day. Though in no conventional sense, settlers, Jamaica's brown men, as they were known, occupied the same role in society as did settlers in Kenya or Rhodesia. They stood out by virtue of their skin color as well as their wealth. They employed black men as gardeners and as menial laborers, and their wives as home help and nannies. Stuart Hall, the great cultural theorist, would describe this separation as the two Jamaicas, the white and brown country to which he belonged, as he put it, and the mass of lower-class black Jamaicans, utterly separate. Marcus Garvey had once written, and I'll quote him here, that the black man is kept down and is trampled on by all the shades above, written in a letter to an African-American educator. And this applied just as easily to the 1950s as it did when Garvey wrote those words in 1916. This was the situation in 1953 when the Colonial Office sent a secret circular out to its Caribbean departments. It sought news about whether Mau Mau was having any impact, and it received from across the Caribbean a series of resounding yeses. In Jamaica, the British information officer wrote that there was, and I quote, widespread support for Mau Mau throughout the Caribbean based on purely racial grounds. This was a misreading of Jamaican society, though, where the most radical politician, Alexander Bustamante, soon to be knighted, regularly appeared on the front page of his party's newspaper, resplendent in white tie. Like Bustamante, and we can trace his aversion to radical black groups back to his correspondence in the 1930s. For him, for Jamaica's middle and upper classes, the Kenyan conflict was an expression of atavistic savagery. The Jamaican press demonized Mau Mau in a way that would have made the Daily Telegraph proud, as, and I quote, a barbaric sect which was fiendishly bloodthirsty and grimly inhuman. Public figures in the colony's middle class gave voice to the threat of a Mau Mau-style episode in Jamaica, aware of potential similarities between the Jamaican and Kenyan situations. They saw how Mau Mau inspired ordinary Jamaicans. I'll quote one regular columnist, Veer Johns, and this is writing in Jamaica's most radical newspaper, I should point out. There are elements in Jamaica who preach violence as a means of achieving self-government for our country, he said. They fasten on the Kenya incidents with relish and directly convey the impression that Jamaica needs some local Mau Mau society to correct its wrongs. The middle classes in Jamaica tended to have a relationship with Africa that we might describe as holding it at arm's length. Certain issues concerned them, apartheid in the 1950s and 60s, sure. But when it came to Kenya, if one was to seize upon such a topic, it was to do with the detention of Jomo Kenyatta, who would become Kenya's first president. Kenyatta was logically attractive to Jamaica's middle class. He was a relatively conservative politician, educated at the London School of Economics, and represented a traditional vision of Pan-Africanism through his work at the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945. But Kenyatta was one thing, Mau Mau was another. And they were quick to denounce that movement in the strongest possible terms. These efforts were mirrored on a global scale at Bandung in 1955. Delegates from 29 nations drew attention to conflicts across the colonized world. Frequent mentions of Algeria, of Morocco, of South Africa, but only the odd mention of Kenya, and of course, nothing about Mau Mau. Fighting apartheid was an issue on which everyone could agree. Mau Mau was far messier. But for Jamaica's lower classes, and especially in Kingston's slums, support for Mau Mau bubbled. The sympathy was inspired in the squalor and deprivation in which so many lived. Across the island, sympathetic men and women held meetings. Some involved the Universal Negro Improvement Association, where Amy Jacques Garvey spoke frequently about Kenya. Many more were more spontaneous. In Jonestown one night in January of 1953, a small slum area to the east of Trenchtown, with apparently little pre-planning or organization, 2,000 people came together to pass a resolution against the barbaric and terroristic practices of the British in Kenya. Even beyond the confines of Western Kingston, and Western Kingston has for a long time been the colony's hotbed of radicalism. We saw this. The theme appeared prominently at meetings of the People's National Party, the party of Bustamante's cousin, Norman Manley. People demanded that discussions about Jamaica's domestic agenda be put on hold. They wanted, they said, to speak about Mau Mau. In many cases, the chairs of these meetings told the speakers to sit down so that they might proceed with their agendas, but they were shouted down. Many of those who interrupted in this manner haven't been invited, but had chosen to invite themselves to these gatherings. It was in Kingston, though, that we saw the Mau Mau gang with which I began this talk. In early 1954 and into 1955, Kingston experienced a wave of violence from the Mau Mau gang. Gangs provided an avenue for success for youths who had neither the education nor the financial resources to achieve it otherwise. One former gang member, asked about the name Mau Mau, explained that it was to signal, and I quote him here, to white Jamaicans, the British colonial population, and all white people living in Jamaica, that the intention of these gangsters was to kill them in the same way that Mau Mau were killing the whites in Kenya. And even though Mau Mau will kill a tiny number of whites in Kenya, this is the prevailing story that appears in the press. It's starting to have unintended consequences elsewhere. At this juncture, having drawn Jamaica into the orbit of Mau Mau, we must ask, why Jamaica? Why do we not see this affiliation in Trinidad or in Grenada? The answer, I think, relates to slavery. The all-encompassing experience of slavery sat at the core of Jamaican society, dominating and recurring in the Jamaican worldview, as Stuart Hall puts it. In the 1920s and 1930s, supporters of Marcus Garvey had brought the experience of slavery into mainstream debate. They fused that history with contemporary activism in a way that predated the other Caribbean islands. By the 1940s, this opening up of debate was catalyzed by daily radio broadcasting, featuring African-American musicians like Duke Ellington and Paul Robeson. In addition, few drew a distinction between the historic experience of slavery and the colonial system that followed in Jamaica. Thus, in contemporary interviews, people raise Mau Mau in the context of a long history of battling against the slave system and its plantation society legacies. Men and women who lived in poorer parts of Kingston during the 1950s revealed how Mau Mau's underdog struggle was inspirational for those battling similar odds in Kingston's shanties. I'll repeat the words of just one man for whom Mau Mau was living proof of the fight one had to undertake to survive. Every man is supposed to fight for his rights in life, he explained to me. And this man was a shopkeeper. He was missing one eye from a street fight when he was younger. He found this inspirational. That's the life I love, he said. Jamaica's poor conceived of Africa and their connection to it in a quite different way than the upper and middle classes. For poor Jamaicans, Africa operated on two levels. On one, it was inspirational and represented a vision of living and behavior that contrasted the poor conditions in which they were forced to live. In this sense, Africa operated as a touchstone in a somewhat similar way to the middle classes where they brought it up. But second, it represented an additional physical space where a new life could be crafted. A place where one might go and find success and stability beyond the Caribbean. Wealthy Jamaicans, of course, tended to view these sorts of itinerant aims as at best a pipe dream and at worst suggesting mental illness. This was emphatically demonstrated in the Back to Africa movement during the 1950s. Back to Africa is often discussed in the context of the Rastas, whose desire to return to Ethiopia has been well documented. But decades earlier, Garvey had described to blacks that they were the children of Israel, yearning for the promised land of Africa from where they had been exiled. Thousands of Jamaicans had personal histories of migrant labor like Garvey. So in 1959, when Rastas poured down to Kingston's waterfront to await passage to Africa, they were joined by thousands who were not members of the faith. These people had seen fit to sell all of their belongings and were awaiting transport. Squatters in Trenchtown sung, "We want a place to live, or send us to Africa," as bulldozers destroyed their homes. In a guest column for Public Opinion, one of the Jamaican papers, Harlem-based journalist W.A. Domingo noted this transition. As he put it, it used to be fashionable for Jamaicans of color to boast of their European connections, however slight, while deprecating or completely ignoring their ties with Africa. But this had changed. Thousands of poor Jamaicans began writing to the Liberian consul in Kingston, demanding permission to go back. Jamaica's politicians paid lip service to African issues, particularly with Ghana's decolonization on the horizon in 1957. But it was lip service. Perhaps nowhere was this trope clearer than when Bustamante, on the right here, labeled Ghana not as civilized as Jamaica on the floor of Parliament. This forced Chief Minister Norman Manley, his cousin, to apologize to the world. The period was a pivotal one, coming at a moment of reorientation for Pan-Africanism around 1960. The global outlook that Garvey had represented, a united community of millions of blacks, was starting to slowly fade from view. Apparently staunch Pan-Africanists like Nkrumah were beginning to focus concretely on national politics. Grassroots intellectuals, their names often untraceable, challenged the Padmores and Nkrumahs, for few had missed the great irony, as Simon Gikandi puts it, that the men and women who met to plot the future of Pan-Africanism were also the most westernized of colonial subjects. In Jamaica, the traditional Pan-African vision was represented by two men. The first was the Trinidadian intellectual George Padmore on the left here, whose writings appeared largely in the press. And the second was the South African commentator and novelist Peter Abrahams. Abrahams was on the radio 6 times a week by the late 1950s and died, in fact, tragically earlier this year. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Padmore and Abrahams had made their positions clear. Padmore had described as an African, and I quote, anybody who believes in one man, one vote, much to the horror of the scholar Sinclair Drake. Peter Abrahams had told Jamaican blacks that they were, and I quote, as free as you can find on earth. One can easily imagine the rage a squatter in Western Kingston felt being told that he or she was free while his or her shack was bulldozed. We might turn to the assassination of Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba in January of 1961 as an example of such a challenge to these men. Stan Grant, a staunch Africanist in the UNIA, led marchers from Victoria Park down King Street in central Kingston. Together with a number of Rastas, marchers were there to express their anger about Lumumba's killing. They flew flags with slogans like, "The color bar must go," "Keep Africa black, death to the enemies of black supremacy," and "Long live the Negro race." Grant had adorned himself in a form of traditional African dress, and the marchers shook their fists at Barclays Bank as they walked past it. At the end of the march, Amy Jacques Garvey gave a speech. Grant then took on Peter Abrahams, attacking him for his conservative approach. He dismissed the novelist's authority to speak on African topics and explained how he was enraged by Abrahams's recent commentary on Lumumba, calling the South African a traitor, and, I quote, declared that if he had given that broadcast in an independent African country, he would have been given 24 hours to clear out. Now, of course, no discussion of these topics in Jamaica should avoid the all-important Rastas, with whom I end today's talk. The photo you can see here on the left is Mortimer Plano, one of the most significant intellectuals of the time. That there is a strong connection between Mau Mau and Jamaica's Rastafari during the 1950s is clear. Identifying with Mau Mau gave them, as Horace Campbell puts it, a sense of dignity and black pride and self-respect. They too marched in Kingston in support of Mau Mau. They stood on soapboxes on street corners and were arrested speaking about Mau Mau. Interestingly, the approach of the press in Jamaica was to label radical class, lower class protest as Mau Mau, and people who spoke about it as preaching the Mau Mau doctrine. Rastas in the press became bearded terrorists, that same noun used to describe Mau Mau in Kenya. The roots of Rastafari intellectual thought are found in the African diaspora, an orientation it maintained in contrast to nation-state politics. The chief formulator of the movement, Leonard Howell, had worked in Panama and become friends with Padmore and Garvey in Harlem during the 1930s. For Rastas, it was essential to build an alternative African history to the Western version. In 1935, therefore, Howell authored The Promised Key. It sought to fuse politics, belief, and history to create legitimacy and appeal for the Rastafari movement. Adam, Eve, and Abraham stood in contrast to King Alpha and Queen Omega, as Howell put it, black arch sovereigns of most holy times. Now, for many scholars, Rastas are one thing, poor Jamaicans are another. I would suggest, though, that the separation between the two has been overemphasized. Rather than thinking of Rastas as one thing and lower-class black radicalism as another, I would argue that they are part of the same bottom-up swelling of protest in Jamaica. This was a faith in its relative infancy, practiced in dramatically different ways across the island, which then came together and combined with the vibrant, flexible, and complex interactions of lower-class activists and Pan-Africanism. For one thing, Jamaica was too small to keep the two worlds apart. Men, women, and children who were not part of the lifestyle came by Rasta yards to listen to them reason, chant, and drum. We always think of Rastas based on their dreadlocks, but in the 1950s, extraordinarily, and I can say this having looked at probably 15,000 different issues of all press organs in Jamaica at this point, it is almost impossible to find a single mention of dreadlocks anywhere in there. And these are newspapers that are obsessed with what Rastas are doing, I can promise you that. You can see here the supporters of Claudius Henry, one of the most prominent Rasta leaders at this time. None of them are wearing dreadlocks. Some wore long hair, some were clean-shaven, many wore beards, and in fact, beard is the term that the press used to describe them, nothing to do with hair. But wearing a beard was also a sign of protest in Kingston in the 1950s and 60s. We have a lot of oral testimony about rascals as opposed to Rastas, people who would dress as Rastas to cause crimes. So I would say the lines are a bit more blurred than we've given credence to. Among Rasta leaders, to be sure, like Claudius Henry, we saw powerful efforts to connect their struggle to the global Pan-African movement. Henry did this frequently. He tied the experience of black Africans and African Americans to the Jamaican situation. One night, he might deliver a speech standing in front of large pictures of Dooley Martin and Burt Moore, showing their actual lynchings in Columbus, Mississippi in 1935. On another, he might explain, and I'll quote him here, "I want Mr. Norman Manley and his white wife to go down Alabama and see if they won't lynch him. He is pro-white." Exodus to Africa was held up as the only tonic, and Henry himself would actually travel to Ethiopia to try to achieve this. As with Lumumba's assassination, the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa in March of 1960 was another focal point. When it comes to radical thinkers in the Caribbean, a name we are all familiar with comes to mind. That of Walter Rodney, the Guyanese intellectual. And in fact, the book here was assigned to me in my first week as a graduate student here at Harvard by Emmanuel. Rodney's activism demonstrated Mau Mau's importance and a distinct version of grassroots Pan-Africanism. Rodney took up his position as lecturer in history at the University of the West Indies Mona campus in the late 1960s, where he would then build links between the campus and Kingston's lower classes. He would pull in urban youth, Rastas, and other diverse activist groups. Rodney's associates remember him lecturing about Mau Mau as the Black Power movement gained strength during the 1960s. They were forceful, Rodney would say of Mau Mau, suggesting that this quality and what he called Mau Mau's revolutionary spirit illuminated a pathway that Jamaica might follow. These talks and lectures reflected the historian's deep sympathies with and interest in Mau Mau. Rodney had conducted first-hand research on Mau Mau's impact in northern Tanzania while teaching at the University of Dar es Salaam, where he had come to view the movement as representing the revolutionary potential of the underclass. In all this, Rodney was tapping into Mau Mau's relevance and gravitas for Jamaica's black struggle. In addition to demonstrating Mau Mau's transatlantic impact, situating the movement in Jamaica in the 1950s further develops our understanding of black radicalism on the island. It reveals an alternative stream of Pan-Africanist thought that derived from a heady mix of lower-class intellectuals, activists, and Rastas. This analysis suggests at least two important ways to alter our thinking about 20th century Pan-Africanist thought. First, orthodox Pan-Africanism involved multi-directional flows of information and interaction. From the United States to Ghana, Trinidad to London, and on to Kenya, and so forth. But lower-class Jamaicans never had the ability to travel internationally or access written or physical networks in this way. Never mediated through London or Paris, these were connections between peripheries with limited actual contact. Second, in our standard framework, Pan-Africanism is limited by the creation of new nations in Africa and the Caribbean in the years around 1960. But when we turn our attention to Jamaica's lower classes and Rastas, it's clear that we must alter our thinking. There's always been this issue in Jamaican history. How do we link the Garvey years to the Black Power years? Jamaicans will tell you when it seemed everything kind of went quiet, we're not really sure what happened there. Using Mau Mau as a lens, though, we can draw an unbroken line from the 1930s through the 1960s and beyond, showing how lower-class activism maintained and honed the ideas of Garvey throughout the period, thus creating the fertile soil that men like Rodney and Stokely Carmichael would find. Thank you very much, everyone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You finished before I could swallow my turkey sandwich. That was fascinating. I missed the very beginning, of course, but are you arguing that Garveyism didn't stop, right? So this Mau Mau ideology or fascination or whatever was grafted onto this black nationalist movement that didn't stop after Marcus Garvey's death.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right, so it wasn't, what was driving the engine wasn't Mau Mau, it was Garvey.
So
Garveyism was the foundation, it was the base, it didn't go away, right?
Absolutely, so Garvey's ideas are very much there, and where they seem to become a little more difficult to trace, I'm using Mau Mau as a lens to show that all of this is going on, yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, manual. Grab a manual. Oh, well, it's too late. I guess he's got to go. I should have asked him if he had, I thought he was going to be here to ask the question. You want to ask a question? He's coming back. I'm sorry, good brother. I didn't know you had to leave. You want to ask a quick question, make a comment? Sure. I dragged you back here. Now you got to say something.
what I think I'm fascinated by are these connections between African nationalist movements and what we're seeing in the diaspora. We're seeing interesting connections. For example, Leila Ahmed in the Divinity School has been working, looking at the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and its connections with the Black Power movement and how they sort of had interesting parallels. So there's a small body of work that is beginning to signal in very important ways how these parallel developments in Africa and in the Americas bring together groups that we would not expect logically to be connected. So that is what I find fascinating about it. And thank Brother Skip for bringing me back.
For 1 second, because what would be interesting to me, let's say you two, if he wrote on what was happening in Jamaica and you wrote simultaneously on what was happening in Ghana, that would be an amazing thing. Because George Padmore was Anthony Appiah's parents' best man, right? So their ideology, and Padmore was on the left, so they couldn't be race-based ideology, right? They had to critique race as the base in superstructure. And Nkrumah, what you said about Nkrumah, though, focusing on the nation, he was still very much an ideological Pan-Africanist because he was going to be the first president of the United States of Africa, right? So I'd like you to sort of respond to that because you implied that Nkrumah then gets off the Pan-African bandwagon and plunges deep or headlong into what was happening in local Ghana. He had to do that, but he still at least was paying lip service to Pan-Africanism, right?
And indeed, Ghana was the haven for many of these nationalist and freedom fighters through Nkrumah's overthrow. From South Africa, I mean, someone like Robert Mugabe's first wife being a Ghanaian, that's not a coincidence. Yes, and it is when Nkrumah was overthrown, people will head in two directions. Some to the Caribbean, others went to Dar es Salaam, which became the next kind of hub of the African socialist and Pan-Africanist movement.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you said that someone would have met Garvey in the 30s in Harlem. He was expelled. Remember, he's deported, right? I don't think. When was Garvey deported?
I had in my head in the early 30s, but was it earlier than that?
I believe it. Somebody fact checked that, but remember, he's in jail. When they get him out, they kick him out of the country. I don't think he was allowed to come back. So you might check that. And the final thing is, who controlled the Daily Gleaner? You know, that's the only newspaper I know from Jamaica, but it was the mulatto elite or the British colonials, right, or a mixture. So they had to beat up black nationalists and, you know, what I like about, I liked your whole talk, but I love the fact that you're showing the complexity of what we often generalize as monolithic societies. They were divided by race, color as class, and ideology reflecting economic interests, and they were enormous economic. Anyway, you can respond to whatever you want, but I loved your talk. It's great. And I met Rodney, by the way, when I was, I just turned 20. I was spending a gap year in Tanzania, gap year between my sophomore and junior year at Yale. And I was working at Mission Hospital, and I went into Dar es Salaam. And I went to a conference at the University of Tanzania, heard Walter Rodney speak in December 1970, one of the great days of my life. I didn't even know, I just knew he was a great man. I didn't know what, I hadn't read him before that. Anyway, end of parenthesis.
Thanks, Skip, for those comments, and I'd come to them in reverse order, if I may. There's not a quote from the Daily Gleaner in this talk. This is all the most radical Jamaican press, and even so, we're seeing this. There's nothing. The Gleaner's nowhere near this. The Gleaner makes these guys. You know, that's a whole different thing. The connection between Garvey and Leonard Howell is fascinating. Howell is also in New York. He's quite a peripatetic guy. He's around the Caribbean. He's in Harlem. He becomes quite close with Garvey, I think, outside of Jamaica. And then when they come back to Jamaica, they sort of hold one another at arm's length. Garvey will end up calling Howell's movement a cult and being quite dismissive of him. And then finally, the ideology versus reality question is a really interesting one. And this, to me, is the sort of the crux of this talk. You know, am I right in saying that you know, Pan-Africanism sort of loses some of its real kind of authority around 1960? And to me, this all comes back to that old classic by Basil Davidson, The Black Man's Bird and the Nation State in Africa. Irrespective of what we're talking about, these are new countries that are based on old colonial boundaries, where it is about national politics, irrespective of what else we say. So for me, on the ground, I do see Pan-Africanism in the late 1950s as there being this possibility of, well, this could be this United States of Africa. This is something that actually could be implemented. Right. But by 1960, we're still talking about the notions, but that reality has gone. That is my sort of take on it.
Because 19 African nations became independent in 1960 or 16, whatever it is. All of a sudden, the fact of nation, you know, I'm the president of,
right.
And screw you, you know.
Right. And this is one of the great issues with all of these Pan-African congresses, with really one or two exceptions, depending on how you look at it, are pretty elite things. We see this particularly at the 6th Pan-Africanist Congress in Tanzania in 1974, that all of these radical black groups, and I'm thinking of like New Jewel in Grenada and groups like this, are explicitly told they can't come. This is about nation states and the leaders of nation states that can come here. Some of them show up. Some of them end up getting invites, but the model of the nation state is still privileged over that kind of lower black mass of suffering people. Would be my distinction.
And that was a problem with Festac, too, as late as 77. Who, if you're a part of a radical group in, say, Senegal, do you have a right? Who gives you the right to, you got to get a passport, you got to get a visa.
Right.
And all these governments were respecting each other. The only people who were at that in 1974, that I can think of, the only large group that didn't have to ask their government, in fact, went in spite of their government, were the black Americans, right? Because they didn't come from a black country, and Amiri Baraka was there being, you know, his whatever ideology he happened to have been in that particular moment. Anyway, let's open this up. This is fascinating. Questions, comments, please. Yes. Christian will give you the microphone.
Okay, sorry, I just have a quick question. As an oral historian, you mentioned that there are these connections developing between peripheries, but with limited actual contact. So I was just wondering if you could trace a few of those actual pathways of communication between these peripheries that allowed you to trace this story and like build these connections.
Did you say actual connections?
Yeah, so the pathways of that actual communication,
Yeah.
like where people are hearing these stories and where they're feeling that kind of connection from.
That's a great question. The actual connections between peoples at these sort of lower registers of society, however we want to think about it, are pretty limited. They're getting a lot of information from whatever they can glean from the regular Jamaican press. Padmore's writing a lot about Mau Mau. So that at least the news of it is in the press. But we're also seeing Rasta groups, and I'm thinking particularly of Robert Hines, subscribing to the Pittsburgh Courier and one or two other prominent African-American papers to get that information too. Now, one of the really interesting things that joins Rastas and Mau Mau is that there's this real reading, written, real deep intellectual culture among Rastas, but the police do what they did with Mau Mau in the late 50s and 60s, in that they go into these areas, they raid it, and they just burn stuff. And that's why we have such a limited documentary record of Mau Mau, because the district officers are told, start the fires. We are burning all of these records. So Pinnacle, Howell's community, is raided in 1954, and the police just cart off all of the written material, the journals that he writes, everything, and they just burn it. So the final thing that I would say about it is that in very rare occasions, we get the examples of Kikuyu in Kenya publishing letters, or at least they seem to be from Kikuyu in Kenya, publishing letters in the Caribbean press. They are few and far between. There's one in the Barbados Observer in 1953. There are very, very few. But they say, we are being tortured in Kenya. This is a story that Carolina has brought out, of course. We are being tortured here in Kenya. We're having boiling water poured on us. And there's, in this letter in the Observer, women are having their breasts removed. And this is published in the Barbados Observer to enormous furore and anger. So the connections are very limited, but there are some threads that go outside the islands.
Hi, I love this talk. As a person that kind of considers himself a makeshift radical hip-hop historian, there are all types of connections, subliminal connections between people such as the Wu-Tang Clan, Dead Prez, Mos Def, who has often referenced the Mau Mau. I was wondering if you've investigated any of the lineage of the music from then to now, because I can see some origins of hip-hop even in the way they dress, even in the continuation of some of the just the poses and the pictures. It looks very reminiscent to some things you see down the road in the development of a black power, a black nationalist, Pan-African type of ideology that emerged in some of the early portions of hip-hop.
Tef, thanks for the question. And you know, it's funny, I came last night to your event, Whose Streets, and listened to you guys give the panel about Ferguson afterwards. You know, as I was coming back to rehearse this talk, and there were all sorts of things that popped out as far as thinking about radicalism and, you know, the kind of examples of these sorts of movements and what it might say about contemporary US and all of these things that we should chat about. When it comes to the music, I'm going to give you a fairly disappointing answer, in that I am not somebody who knows a whole lot about music. I can talk to you about cricket until the cows come home. What I would say is one of the most prominent artists in Jamaica, Winston Rodney, in the 1950s, takes this stage name, Burning Spear. And he takes that name because that's Kenyatta's nickname. And he has had this, you know, 50-year career based all around that name that he took from Kenyatta. So it seems to me that there are, and there would be a lot of threads, but I just don't know them, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Thanks, Myles. I too was very impressed with your the way in which you showed us that Pan-Africanism is not singular by any means, and also your kind of movement between these two locations, Kenya and Jamaica, as treating them both as centers rather than just a kind of center with the other place being the margins or the influence. And I really liked your attention to histories in both of those places. When you were talking, of course, the whole time I was asking inside my head, why Jamaica? And you answered that at some point saying the answer is in slavery. But then the next question is then why Kenya, right? Because it was not involved in the slave trade, or not a site. It would be Ghana or some, you know, one of the places more directly involved. And everything you were saying was talking about colonialism as the connection. And I would say not even colonialism, but neo-colonialism, because you were talking about sort of brown-skinned people beginning to occupy these places of authority. And I find it, you know, we can talk about even like different forms of the presses, but I'm sort of wondering, you know, if there is something even more radical going on here in terms of predicting a kind of future path of what's happening in the process of decolonization. And so even within something that could be seen as liberatory and forward-looking and radical, like Pan-Africanism also has these pitfalls. I mean, I'm wondering, you know, if you could talk a little bit about the colonial aspect of that.
Sure. Absolutely, Jenny. The British faced this sort of problem in the 1950s because they're trying to create a lot of propaganda for all of the colonies. And they back themselves into this sort of corner where they start publishing enormous amounts of material. I mean, in Kenya alone, about 28 million pages of propaganda are produced in 6 months in the 1950s, and that's just Kenya. Centered from the UK, tons of propaganda is coming out to the islands. And the British take this approach, which is, we've got to talk about how horrendous Mau Mau is, and we've got to, make everyone realize that this is a terrible thing, and they demand all these photos of atrocities from Kenya, and they bring them up, and they try to decide where they should distribute them, and they have them in the House of Commons reading room because it's too offensive to have in the main chamber, and women aren't allowed to look at them because they're too shocking. And then they come to the conclusion that by the mid-50s that all they're succeeding in doing is giving all of these lower-class radical groups this inspirational source of these guys. Really, you horribly slaughtered this white settler? Don't have too much of a problem with that, actually. And so they come to this point where they're saying, look, we've provided all of this information. We've talked about Mau Mau endlessly in the colonies, radio broadcasts, mobile cinemas, all of these kinds of things. And all we've kind of succeeded in doing is giving people this potential model for ways to protest. And I think colonialism really is an important link, because in Jamaica, we have the governor of Jamaica writing to Kenya and saying, look, we think that a Mau Mau type thing might kick off here. Could you send us the text of your emergency legislation so that we can kind of plagiarize it and use it in Jamaica if the need comes? Wow. So there are, pardon?
What year was that?
53 and 53 and 54. And it's a lot of, yes, absolutely. And a lot of it's being pushed by the colonial office, who is saying to Jamaica, hey, you guys have got to get on this quickly. Writing laws takes some time. Now, your question about future pathways and decolonization is for me, sort of the most interesting thing here. And I've had it in previous versions of this paper, but I can't figure out a way to use it. And that is using Mau Mau and Rastas and bringing them together as a group to say that these two groups of people are suggesting an alternative way of living and doing community outside of the nation. We know this very, very clearly in Mau Mau, that Mau Mau is producing identity cards, making their own postal system. They have typewriters in the forest that they're writing out directives, they're writing histories, they're bookkeeping. They are substituting the state, essentially, in Kenya. And it struck me as very similar to what Haile is trying to do at Pinnacle in some of these other areas, and saying, look, the nation state is nothing to us. It's not going to help us. We know this. Get independence under Manley and Buster, great. Doesn't matter. Just another brown guy who's going to do the same thing to us. And so Haile is, I think, doing something quite similar at his communes and saying, well, this is a piece of land that we can farm in the way that we want. We can be governed by the laws that we have chosen. We have our own newspapers and our own journals. And so creating these sort of separate communities away from the nation, I think you could make that case. I can't quite make it yet, but I think that's a possible future path. So that, for me, I think there's probably something in there as far as saying, look, and that's why I hate the term transnationalism. Transnationalism is just talking about, it's about nations. Pull the nation out of it. Let's see what people are doing. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
Garvey, Abby just sent me an email. 27.
27 he left? So Haile must come across, he comes across, maybe it's in Panama. Is Garvey in Panama in the early 20s?
Well, he was in New York, he was in jail. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'd have to check that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They come across one another somewhere in that diaspora.
How about London?
Yeah. Howell's not in London, though.
Is Hal related to, is Darkest Hal related to this Hal?
Not that I know of, no. But Howell's another fascinating character. This is a guy who, when uses, for the first time, and I have a separate piece about this, about the way that Rastas are using the British colonial system, using the court system as a way to publicize their course and use its mechanics for their own ends. So Howell comes up on charges of sedition in 1935, and he has a 3-day trial in which he refuses the use of a barrister, and he expounds the Rasta faith from the dock in a way that drives it into the public sphere in a way it had never been before. He refuses to swear on the Bible and actually claims to be a Muslim at that point, and then takes on this sort of alternative Hindu personality in the 1950s. So he's really kind of this fascinating blend of different things from the diaspora that he's putting together and creating this.
Have you tied him to, who was Elijah Muhammad's mentor?
Ford?
Yeah, W.D. Fard, who did a similar kind. They were nationalist and mystical and, quasi Pan-African, and he had a Middle Eastern identity. I mean, this figure tied
Yeah, yeah, and especially in Jamaica, where this is coming out of a background of revivalist Christianity and Mylism and Pocomania and all of these things that are fusing together.
So is Rastism a branch of Garveyism?
Is what, sir?
Is the Rasta movement an outgrowth of the Garvey base? Is it something that takes off from the foundation of Garveyism?
It is, whether that is its base, I wouldn't want to answer, but absolutely it's coming out of that tradition. Absolutely, yeah. Is it Panama?
Garvey was?
He started in Costa Rica and then went to Panama.
Okay, that may be the question. Yeah.
Chris is in charge of the mic.
Thank you for your fascinating presentation. I spent lots of time in Jamaica in the 60s, and I agree with your description and your analysis. What I'd like to ask you about is the impact of Jamaica and the Caribbean on political developments in East Africa. We know that Walter Rodney who was teaching at UWI, as you mentioned, he was denied a visa to return to Jamaica when we were at the Black Power Conference in Montreal together in fall of '69. And I'm thinking now of Dudley Thompson, who was foreign minister in the Manly PNP party, People's National Party. He was a lawyer for Mau Mau and Dudley and Kenyatta. Could you say a little bit about, please, the impact of Jamaica on Kenyan and East African political consciousness and development?
Absolutely, and I'm fascinated to hear about Montreal, and I'd love to chat after the talk. The real connection going the other way is Dudley Thompson, although if we wanted to take East Africa a bit more broadly, Rastas going back to Ethiopia, we could bring in the same context. Thompson has this, Thompson is involved in defending Kenyatta at his trial in 1953. And he comes back to Jamaica with his wife, in fact, and they give a series of high-profile talks in which they draw attention to what's going on in Kenya, but the Colonial Office reports that Thompson in 1955, and I quote, denounces Mau Mau as a savage society at that point. Rastas don't believe he said that, but that's at least what the Colonial Office records. We don't see very much in Kenya's under this highly restrictive state of emergency in the 50s. So it's very difficult to trace much of, I think Thompson is probably the only or one of a tiny number of Jamaicans or people from the Caribbean who are actually there. And Thompson is, of course, in Tanzania for quite a bit of that time as well. So I would think the only link we could find probably is in Kenyatta, would be my suspicion of impacts going that way. But if you might permit me to come the other way for a moment again, there's an Irish lawyer called Peter Evans who has been going around in Kenya in 1954 collecting evidence of abuses carried out by the British Army and Kenya police against Mau Mau. He's then deported from Kenya in probably 55 or 56. He shows up in Kingston and he sets up a practice defending Rastas in court. He defends Claudius Henry's son, who is hanged in 1960 for starting a militant rebellion against the British. And in fact, with his last dying breath, Henry's son will say, "I die for Marcus Garvey." So the connections that at least I'm aware of are much more coming the other way. I'm not sure that beyond Dudley Thompson that I would be able to think of much going east. And that may be my own limitations, but off the top of my head, I can't at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for the beautiful presentation. I'd like to ask, I'd like to insist in the Jane Cut questions. How we can justify the importance specific of Mau Mau wars to development of black politics, because we have other important events in the same ages, and it's not totally clear to me why specifically Mau Mau wars.
Great. It's a great question. Why Mau Mau? Why not South Africa? And it's simply that having spent, and I think I picked 5 or 6 of Jamaica's papers, and I read every issue in the 1950s. And it was phenomenally tedious on one level, but I think also important to place myself in Jamaica at that time. We just don't see anything coming up with that sort of regularity. Now, when we get to the end of the 50s, South Africa starts becoming a huge story, especially following Sharpeville in March of 1960. And then Jamaica will take the lead in actually trying to impose sanctions against trade with South Africa in the early 1960s. So once we get later, South Africa is a major story. Once we get to 1960, we see it with Lumumba as well. But one of the questions that I always get is, well, what about Algeria? Are people not talking about Algeria? That's going on. That's this horrendous war. And the answer is no. It's just not there. You can barely find mention of Algeria in the Jamaican press at that time. So I don't know why that's the case. I think my inclination is that the common colonial experience has to be at the core of this, irrespective of whether we want that to be the case. But it's just appearing, and Mau Mau and Kenya are being discussed in an absolutely major way, far more than anything else, if at least the press has any reflection on what's going on. The archives tells us the same story. And a lot of that is to do with Padmore. Padmore has Mau Mau in the press over and over again in the early 1950s. Is it Mau Mau more than anything else? Yes. Why is it Mau Mau? That's a little more opaque. But these Kingston slums are seriously rough parts of town, and people are living, barely access to clean water, packed into rooms, very, very few options. And here we have these guys in Kenya wearing dreadlocks who are taking on this struggle in which they have absolutely no chance on the face of it of winning, yet they kind of are. And so for me, that's at the heart of this, is that this is this kind of underdog struggle. This is, there's no way of kind of taking it to the man more than this. And that, for me, I think, is at the heart of this. And that's what came out of my interviews. These guys would say, look, we have a panga, a machete. We call it machete in Jamaica. It's the same tool that Mau Mau are using. It's a common farming tool in Jamaica. And people are saying, look, they just have this. They've got that I have in my corner. This is all they have. And yet, the British are sending millions of pounds and troops here, and they can't do away with these guys. And that's a really powerful thing.
But Hal, the difference between Algeria and Kenya, at least in the imagination of the West, right, and Jamaica's in the West, is Mau Mau was stereotyped as black people rising up to cut the throats of white people. Algeria was northern Africans vis-a-vis France, so it's playing itself out differently in terms of race, in terms of color politics. Yeah. I'm not endorsing it, I'm just throwing that out as a possibility. Yeah, do you think that could have been a difference?
That's absolutely probably in it too. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
I might. Yeah, that was a fascinating talk. I loved it. So my question is, how can we connect Haile Selassie with the Mau Maus? Haile Selassie was a feudal. He was serving for 56 years, and it's confusing that the African diaspora, especially in the Caribbean, is depicting him as the revolutionary. There is this reverence. So, as an Ethiopian, I know what Ethiopians think about him, and would you say anything about what was the Jamaican press or anyone living in that time was? Garvey himself was critical of Haile Selassie. In 1937, Garvey was writing a column in a British paper, and he was insulting Haile Selassie as a coward because Haile Selassie fled to England while the Italians were occupying Ethiopia. So, what's your say about this?
Yeah, that's great. And Garvey speaks out against Haile Selassie for doing that in the 30s as well. Haile Selassie is at the heart of this, and in some ways is the sort of key link in this whole piece. When it comes to Selassie, from the British perspective, they are a little confused as to how to handle the Rastas in particular. These guys are talking about Haile Selassie. And you can read the Colonial Office correspondence. in which they say, well, look, what about this? Why don't we write to Haile Selassie, have him write back to us and tell us that he's not a deity, and then we'll give that to the Rastas and then they'll go away. Quite literally, that's the correspondence that goes on here. And what becomes very clear is that the Rastas have their own intellectual background, their own formulation of how Haile Selassie fits into all this. And it doesn't matter what the British are going to do, it's irrelevant. So they have their own vision of Haile Selassie as a divinity in most of the Rasta houses at least, who is kind of the central core of all of this. Now, when we get to around 1960, it becomes very clear to Manley and Bustamante that they have got to do more to connect to the mass of black Jamaicans. And so Manley says, well, he's trying to win an election with the People's National Party. And he says, well, look, we've got to play up these links somehow. And Manley is always on the back foot because he he prosecutes Garvey twice in the 1930s and 40s, and the other side uses that to get at him quite a bit. So Manley sponsors this mission to Africa in 1961, in which several Rastas and a delegation of Jamaicans go to Ethiopia and a number of other African countries in an effort to say, look, the government is connecting to you. But the key moment in all of this is when Haile Selassie comes to Jamaica in 1966. And look, let's be clear, it's not that the Rastas are the only ones out there to visit Haile Selassie. This is tens of thousands of people who come out to greet his plane, to the point at which they're not even sure that they're going to open the door and he's going to come out because the police cannot keep a hold of this crowd. So Haile Selassie is hugely important for Rastas, but for a lot of other Jamaicans, they'll say to you, look, we needed to see this guy. We needed to see this black monarch who comes here and holds himself, and all the Rasta accounts speak to this, holds himself in a certain way. All of them comment on this. He looked like a king. He stood the right way. He looked like a monarch. It was his behavior that was so important. And so that's this kind of transformative moment. And then in Jamaica in the 1970s, we move into a far more radical government under Manley's son, Michael Manley. So Haile Selassie is in many ways sort of the key figure in all of this. Although his divinity is considered a slightly different thing depending on which house of the Rastas that you're talking about. Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Salim Hassan from Los Angeles. I'm visiting. Anyway, part of your discussion was about poverty. And there's a Caribbean psychiatrist, Dr. Frantz Fanon, that wrote a book called Black Skin, White Mask, where he suggested that Black Caribbean Africans are very busy consciously and unconsciously mimicking the model of the master, which is about relative exclusive socioeconomic behavior. So it's not peculiar that you have political people who are very rich and you have all this poverty, such as in Soweto and in the Sudan. I lived in Hawaii for 10 years, and Asians were brought to Hawaii as contract laborers for the sugarcane and pineapple because though pineapple and white leadership didn't want black or Latin people there as farmers. And these Asians, to transcend the racist behavior of the people that brought them, developed an inclusive socioeconomic behavior of putting some of their pennies, energies, and expertise together that's probably called a hui. Now, LAUSD, the public school system in Los Angeles, is 74% Latino. And so the school district said, we just can't teach this American program anymore. All graduating seniors must take a diversity class. One of these classes is called RISE, Responsible Indigenous Social Entrepreneurship. Before I came to this lecture, I was looking at the Harvard Business Bulletin and the local newspaper, the student newspaper, which was doing what I call a fundraising 101 request for the people who are suffering in Texas, which suggests to you that this campus is clueless of indigenous financial literacy. And I'm suggesting, and with a question, if people fail to acculturate with other cultures in support of the quality of their lives, then they have a codependency with the educational systems to resolve that contradiction. And this suggests to you that Harvard, specifically Harvard, is not doing that. How do you feel about that? And part of it, I went to the University of Colorado and was introduced to a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Fede talked about collective dynamics, and if you integrate collective dynamics with the Hui, you have collective socioeconomic dynamics. Just think how more effective the Rastas and all these people you're talking about would have been if they were developing in this domain.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You know, I am probably not the person who's qualified to answer that
Yeah, what do you have
question.
to say about Harvard? We know that you run it, Myles. And
Yeah. Yeah, Skip, I think you might be better qualified to answer that question. But
I'm just a poor black man trying to make it in the world.
Yeah, yeah. I would just say two brief things, though. First of all, as an observation, that what you're talking about here, particularly the financial aspect, is something that came through very clearly in the conversation that we had with the people who had produced the Who Streets documentary in Ferguson last night. And saying that the core of this, the director was saying, has to be some sort of economic transformation. Also quite critical of the fact that, you know, Harvard is this very elite institution. We get that. I'll just say that as an observation. And then I will end, as I think it's about that time, by just pointing out this brilliant thing that kind of complicates everything that I've just said, where Stokely Carmichael in the 1960s and early 1970s is talking about Fidel Castro as the blackest man in the Caribbean. And applying the same term to Mao as well, and saying, well, you know, it's not quite just about race, but it's about revolutionary spirit and wanting to help the poor as well.
And part of that motivation was they were seeking exile in Cuba.
It's not going to hurt.
So ideology. But I found your question fascinating. And I remember when we were students, I just turned 67, the pedagogy of the oppressed was just a assigned reading. You know, I don't think people it's assigned anymore, not like it was then. But I would just caution you to remember that the thing about Harvard is there's not a central beating heart here. You know, there's not, what's the IBM computer called? Watson. There's no Watson running Harvard. I'll tell you a funny story. I mean, we're all running Harvard in our own little, part. There's not an overriding consciousness here, and it is in contradiction with itself a lot. And you can affect what Harvard thinks or what it does. The Hutchins Center, well, I don't have to ask anybody to issue a statement about something political. We could just issue it. See what I mean? So it's not as if, I'll tell you a funny story. One of my best friends is Marxist. He's an African and a professor in our department, right upstairs, the Department of African-American Study. And Biadoun Jafo, I'll tell you who he is. And when he first came here, we recruited him from Cornell. He kept saying, Harvard this, Harvard that, when was Harvard this? And he was talking about all the things that he was referring to were things that we could just vote on and do as a department. Finally, I raised my hand and said, BJ, Harvard is us. You know, we are Harvard. If you want to do that, we can do it. We don't have to go and ask somebody about it. And that's one of the great things about a decentralized power. So I love your ideas about how to intervene in those very issues. But we can talk about that later. Let's give it up to Myles for a fabulous, fabulous presentation. It's great.
Thanks, Will.